everybody, and welcome back to the Fur and Fam YouTube channel. In this week's episode of the van build series, we're going to go through the steps that we took to get the framing in the walls and in the ceiling. We're also going to go through the steps that we took to run our electrical conduit before we sprayed all the spray foam in the van. So we're going to start off here with a real quick summary, and then after we get through the summary, we'll go into the longer step-by-step process that we took and use a little bit of our time-lapse footage to help explain that. But first, a quick summary. So, the studs that you see in the walls here, these are 2x4s that we cut to fit flush with the steel on the van. We did this in order to maximize the space. There's basically 2 in each window opening, or where there would be windows in the van. And the same goes for the other side as well. 2 over here, and 2 over here. And then as for the ceiling, we did basically just matched the roof supports that were already in the van and screwed them down. You can see one of the holes there where it attaches to the steel of the van, and made basically match the contours of the van and made a framed opening. And we did this on every one of the metal supports. What we also did is put in our square opening for our fan at the front and our AC unit at the back. And we'll go through the steps that we took in order to make those. For our framing in the walls, we decided to go with a design that allowed us to maximize the space in the van. And the way that we did that was by making the studs fit flush with the flat parts of the van that were exposed. So basically you can see the really three areas where there's structural steel that's flat that we're able to screw to if we need to. We wanted to keep that as basically the widest point in the van and not put a fur strip over it. So in order to do that, we had to match the contour of the van and cut out a stud that would fit inside of the contour. So one thing that we did that we don't show in this video is I took a contour gauge and used that to basically match the angle of the inside of that window opening, and then I traced it on a sheet of paper, and I took a protractor and calculated the angle of that opening. And then I went over to the miter saw, set the miter saw at that angle. I cut a couple of test boards, and it turns out the angle on the contour gauge wasn't exactly the perfect angle that fit in there. The angle that I ended up using was 16.5 degrees, and that worked pretty well. You can see I'm checking all the different openings as I'm making the individual boards, because our van, quite honestly, has been beat up a good bit inside, and so there was some places where certain lengths of the board didn't fit as well as others. So I was adjusting as I went. So I'd cut one, make sure it fit in certain areas, and then, it needs to be a little shorter, a little longer. I would trim as needed to make it fit in that opening just right. And in the end, we wanted to have it a little bit smaller than it needed to be, so it would recess into that opening slightly. We've got a more detailed clip coming up that's going to show exactly how we got the holes drilled in the studs to make them fit within that cavity perfectly, because it ended up we needed a little bit of an angle to go up into the steel and make sure we got a good amount of bite on the sheet metal screws. So what we're doing is drilling the holes in our stud, and we're putting them 1 inch from the end. So mark there, flip the square, and we're spacing them 1 inch off of the outside. So at 1 and 2.5, I'm making a mark. Do the same thing on the other side. 1 inch back, across, 1 inch, 2.5. Then we're going to take the drill, we're going to touch each one of them, drilling straight down. And all this does is start the hole. Then we're going to come back with the drill at a 45-degree angle and punch a hole through the board to the end. Do the same thing on the other side. And what you end up with is a board with 4 holes that will then fit within the cavity inside the van. So here's a closer up view of how the studs fit in the van, and it worked out pretty well. As far as the spacing goes from left to right, we went with a 13-inch spacing. So basically there's 3 metal supports that you can see on each wall, and we're putting 4 studs in. So basically every 13 inches you'll either be able to screw into the metal or screw into one of our wooden studs. And this was just a good even spacing. It's very similar to the spacing that you find in a house for studs. That gives us a good place to screw the walls into when we put them up, and attach cabinets, attach hydroband board for backsplashes and showers, and just basically a good firm attaching point for all of the stuff that we're going to mount to the walls. And so we're going through the process here of getting them in, and it was actually a lot more difficult to get them to be flush. It tended to want to move to one end or the other, and what I ended up doing is trying to get the top to be as perfect as possible, because that's where our walls are going to be. The bottom section of the board where it meets the steel is actually going to be underneath our counter line. You can see the blue piece of tape there right next to the door. That's where our counter is going to be. So pretty much anything below that line in the van is going to be hidden by either the bed or a countertop. So I wasn't as concerned with how that mounted up. And so in the next ones when we put them on, tried really hard to get the top to be flush and let the bottom just kind of move wherever it was. Because what was happening is I drilled pilot holes for the sheet metal screws, because without that, the sheet metal screws don't have a sharp enough tip on them to basically drill where you want them to. Ideally, I should have center punched all of them and then drilled them, and that would have given a much more centered approach there. But for how fast and the time that we were putting into this and the level that it really mattered, we just went with a small pilot hole that it walked a little bit when we drilled it, and then the sheet metal screws, they pulled the wood to one side or the other when we screwed them in. But all in all, the gaps at the top ended up being what we wanted. First strips up the side of the van that just screwed onto the contours of the flat parts basically from top to bottom would have definitely been much easier and much faster. I actually bought the wood to do that, and then I kind of second guessed myself and said, man, I'll be giving up 3/4 of an inch on either side of the van if I do this. So I figured I would give the inside studs a shot and see how they went. And in the end, I'm glad we ended up doing that, because 1.5 inches in a van, I mean, if you take it one time and then you think, okay, well then I put a 3/4 inch back on my cabinets, then okay, there's another 1.5 inches gone, and by the end of it, you're 3-4 inches narrower in your hallway in the middle of the van than you really wanted to be. And so in an effort to maximize space, we took the longer, more complicated route, made the inside studs, and we're happy that we did now, because we've got a little more space in the van. So one thing that Lauren's doing here, she's touching up a couple more places on the van where we brushed some rust out of it, just a little bit of surface rust. The wheel welds, they were pretty bad. They had been scraped really, really badly, so we got a fresh coat of white paint on those, getting them ready for spray foam. And we're starting here to get the ceiling framing put in. And this is another area where on this route I actually kind of took the easier side of things. It works out. I bought 96-inch 2x4s, and so if you cut one perfectly in half, the 48-inch length fits perfectly between 2 of the roof ribs in the van. And so I ended up just maximizing the lumber that we had and using 48-inch strips. And then later you'll see how we put in angled pieces in order to make the sides of the van have something where we could nail to. But basically all we did is drilled 3 holes and put 3 sheet metal screws in each one of the rafters, and basically just screwed it into the steel supports in the van. And the reason that we went this route instead of just putting fir strips right on top of the supports themselves would be, I mean, we gained probably, I mean, it does stick down below the metal ever so slightly on the roof just because the roof's curved and the wood's straight. So in the middle, we lost maybe a half an inch, and on the outsides, we lost maybe a quarter. But it's better than losing 3/4 of an inch all the way around and having super thick ceiling cavities and that we can't really do anything with. In the older T1N Sprinters, one of the roof supports is actually different than all of the rest. And it's the one, it's cut off in the video frame here, but it's a flat, thicker metal versus the other ones that have the actual side to it where you can screw something to. So in order to make that one work, I ended up having to rip a really small piece of wood on the table saw and then rip a couple more pieces to go under it because it's actually round, and I was bolting to the bottom of it, so I had to match the round contour to make it where the piece on the bottom fit flush with the other pieces. And I highly recommend for a van build that you have access to a table saw and a miter saw. Those two tools will make your life so much easier building a van. You can make all the cuts that you need to make with a regular skill saw. It's just you have to set and reset the skill saw angle, and if you're wanting to do a long rip, especially on a really thin piece of wood, then you have to clamp the wood down and make a guide for the skill saw, and it's just a really time-consuming process. I've done a lot of projects with a skill saw, and for the van I finally broke down and bought a table saw. Luckily enough, I was able to borrow a miter saw from my dad, so that has helped a bunch. I mean, it's just, I mean, when you look at all the different angles in the van, when you think about it, all those angles are so much easier to cut with the miter saw. And then for all the ceiling pieces, all of those are 2x4s that are ripped in half. And the reason that we ripped them in half is because you don't need the thickness of a full-size 2x4. And yes, I could have went and bought 2x2 lumber, but one, it's a lot more expensive when you're buying the smaller pieces of lumber like that, as opposed to just buying standard 2x4s that are a dime a dozen and ripping them down to the thickness that you need. And a lot of times, like, I didn't use the exact dimensions of a 2x2. I would rip down to exactly what I needed. So that's where the table saw really came in handy for getting consistent boards that I needed for different areas, like the roof, for example. I mean, those were all, I got double the lumber than I would have out of a 2x2 because I took a 2x4 and cut it in half. Here's where I'm trying to figure out exactly how thick I need to make that piece that I was talking about earlier that fits into the awkward roof support in the T1N Sprinters. So basically all I did was hold up a straight piece of lumber to the two boards spanning across that I had already put up, and then I measured up to that steel support. And that's where I figured out that, hey, the steel support's not exactly flat, it's round, it's about a 1/4 inch thicker in the middle than it is on the ends. And so I did a lot of guessing and checking and measuring and then ripping on the table saw to get the right dimensions. And then it turns out, and I was like, okay, well, I can't get it with one board, so then I had to make multiple boards, and ended up ripping multiple thicknesses and trying multiple boards multiple times. So that's pretty much the story of a van. It's a lot of guess and check, and that's why it's taken so long just to get the framing done, which in all reality, I mean, it was a day and a half, 2 days at most to get it all done. It just seemed like forever, basically. But in the grand scheme of things, it was actually pretty quick. So we're getting the last piece screwed on there. Just put 3 screws into the bottom. And now we're cutting all the pieces that we're going to use to frame out for the air conditioner and the roof vent. So what we had to do is make 14 1/4 by 14 1/4 square openings. And that's the standard dimension for an RV roof opening. When you see it written out online, they call for a 14-inch opening, but it's actually slightly oversized. And the reason that I know that is because I went and downloaded the installation guides for the Dometic rooftop AC unit that we're going to use and for the Maxxair fan that we're going to use. If you're interested in buying either of those two, the same ones that we're going to use, check the links below. I'll include them in this video even though they're not really in this video, but we're making the openings for them. So you can see on the table saw we're ripping down the boards to get the thickness that we want, because we don't need 2x4s in the ceiling. That would have been a lot of overkill framing out for a fan and an AC. So we're cutting down all the dimensions there, and I'm placing them together and figuring out where they need to be screwed together. The one that I'm working on here is for the fan, and it actually goes between the weird roof support and one of the normal roof supports. So the opening, that basically the distance between the two roof supports, is just barely big enough to put in the opening for the fan. And so I'm using the Craig jig here, and I made a rookie mistake. This is the first time I've ever used a Craig jig, and I drilled holes in the side thinking that I could mount the whole entire assembly into the van with Craig screws through the pocket. But what I found is when I put the openings together, actually just the fan opening, the AC one's big enough to where it didn't matter, but this one, the Craig screws ran into the pocket that I would have used to attach it to the van. So I ended up having to regroup there and use a different method to attach it to the van. So I got some bar clamps here. I got it clamped all together, and I'm going to run some Craig screws through the side to hold it all together. And that's when I realized that they're running through the openings that I had already cut for the other Craig screws that would have mounted it into the van. But I was still able to get it in the van with some regular deck screws at different angles to hold it in there well enough to install it. So I wanted to make sure that the fan was in the very center of the van, and luckily the ribs in the van are centered in the roof. So I took my laser level and stuck it to the metal roof and shot a line down the center. I had marked the center of the fan opening, so I just lined those two marks up and then started screwing it in with some deck screws all around, making sure that everything was solid on it. And for the next one, you can see there the boards on this one are longer because the span between the two ceiling framing members is longer, and that's what allowed us. I was actually able to use Craig screws to mount this one into the van, so it's a much more stable opening, which in the grand scheme of things, the AC is a bigger, bulkier unit with more wind drag on the top, so it probably makes sense that it would need a little more support than a Maxxair fan. The Maxxair fan's pretty low profile when you're going down the road, so it's not going to put that much force on the van. And on this one, when I looked at it, it didn't look square when I clamped it. So I measured the diagonals to check square, and I was out about a ½ an inch. So then I got the speed square out and started tapping and adjusting to try to get the whole entire assembly square. I was able to get it within about maybe like a 30-second on each diagonal, so I was happy with that, and I screwed it together. And so I did a similar thing when putting it in the van. I didn't use the laser level on this one. I just made a mark in the center and kind of eyeballed it with the center line of the roof ribs. So the next step is installing the weird angle pieces in the corner of the van. So the one part about framing a van that usually no one likes is trying to figure out what to do in these corners here. Because you can't just make a square corner like you can in a house because the van itself is round. So what we've done is cut two pieces to go in there. And how I got to making these two pieces is I took some scrap lumber and I positioned it up here and basically just held it all together and marked on it where the angles were, and then took it in there to the table saw or in the miter saw and cut the angles on these boards. And I also drilled a hole to allow a sheet metal screw to grab this one. So another thing that I did is I cut a small slot in this piece so that it will actually slide over the little track that's in the van and allow it to fit down snug inside the track and be where it can't move around, because it's only going to get nailed on the top. The bottom will be basically wedged in between the steel of the van. So let's take a look at how it all goes together. So this piece comes in here, slides in. This piece goes in here. Just like that. And then what we'll do is take a sheet metal screw and put it in that hole, and then we're going to take the nail gun and drive a brad nail in there, 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 and there, and then another brad nail into there and there and there and there to connect it, that piece to this piece to this piece, and then they'll all be connected together. Here's a closer look at the process that we went through to get those pieces of lumber cut the way we needed them cut. So we started out by measuring how far up we wanted to go with the straight piece. So I went and got a piece of scrap that was pretty close to that measurement and kind of used it to mock up where I wanted to be. And then I went and got another piece that was about the distance that it was left between the top cross member and the side cross member. And from there, it's pretty much a jigsaw puzzle of figuring out which angle you want and how you want them to mate together. And that's how we ended up with the two pieces that we showed previously in the video. You can see I'm scribing the angles on them, and I just took them over to the miter saw and basically just used the laser cut guide on the miter saw to get the angles that I wanted. So I never really had to measure any angles at all. I just matched it up with what I had scribed on the wood. And so here we're mass producing all of the pieces that we needed, and it turns out we needed two different sides for one of the pieces, and that was basically because of the sides of the van. The middle piece between the top and the side, the angle cuts on it were backwards based off of which way I wanted the screw to go into it. And so I'm going here making the side pieces, cutting the groove in them so they fit in the little channel in the van, and making sure that they're all the same. Basically, I just used the first one as a template and traced it over and over and over and set the saw at the angles that I needed. And one thing to keep in mind when you're using a piece over and over as a guide is always use the same piece. Don't cut a piece and then use it, and then cut another piece and then use the piece that you just cut as the guide for it, because you'll tend to have a drift in your measurements, because there's different things that come into account. The thickness of the saw blade, all your cuts are not going to be perfectly the same every time. So it's always good to use one piece as a guide and just use it over and over so that you don't have that drift. Because then at the end you could be way out by the time you get to the end, and then you got a bunch of scrap that you can't reuse. And so here I'm making the smaller pieces, and we're drilling the holes for the self-tapping sheet metal screws to go into. And really the only reason that I drill a recess hole in it is just so I can use a shorter screw. I've got 1.5 inches and 1.25 inches number 8 sheet metal self-tappers, and those are what we use to put all of it in. And those screws are obviously not long enough to go through a 1.5 inch thick board, and so that's where we had to do a counter bore hole to make it where we could use the shorter screws. And a counter bore hole is basically just a hole that is in the same axis as the hole that you're going to go all the way through the board with. And in this case, we used a 1/2 inch drill bit to give us enough clearance for the socket and for the screw head to go in, and then drilled a smaller hole all the way through so we could attach it to the van with a self-tapping sheet metal screw. So we're going through the process here of getting them all installed. And turns out the top rail of the van is not perfectly flat or uniform either. So I ended up having to cut each one of those side pieces pretty much to fit as I was going. And it's something I cut them all at one time thinking, oh, this will be great, this will go really fast. But then you get in the van, and of course nothing is ever straight or square or true. So I've learned that multiple times now. And so I've got the nail gun here, shooting some nails into it, and I could have run screws into this, but I was at a point where it really wouldn't have been much benefit to drill holes and put screws in and run the risk of punching a screw through the top of the van or anything like that. The nail gun is just an 18-inch brad nailer, or sorry, an 18 gauge brad nail gun, so it wouldn't really have the force to go through the wood and then punch a hole in the van. It would probably just deflect and bend off to the side if that were the case. So getting all those supports put in. Another thing that's really handy is having a impact and a drill set when you're trying to do work in a van. Those two tools, I probably use those just as much as the table saw and the miter saw, putting everything together. I haven't used many nails. So far, the only thing that I've nailed is the side supports in with the nail gun here. I've used screws for everything else, and that's just, it's a better fastener. It gives you a lot more peace of mind knowing that it's not going to work its way out when you're driving down the road and the van's flexing and moving and things like that nature. I mean, in a house, the house is pretty much static, so you can take a nail gun and build a house and not really worry too much about it. But in the van, everything's moving, everything's flexing going down the road, so the screws are just a better fastener to use in vans. So we're getting the last support piece put in here. Turns out it had to be cut down to fit a couple times to get it to fit right, because there was some wiring running under it that I wanted to give enough space for. We're getting it nailed in, and then I go around all of them, put a couple more brad nails in, just because you can never have too many nails to be sure. And now we've made it to the part where we're putting in the electrical conduit. And there's also a shelf over the driver and passenger seat, which will be next week's episode. So if you're curious of how to make a shelf over your driver and passenger seat in a T1N Sprinter, that video will go into great detail to show every single step along the way to make an awesome looking shelf over your driver and passenger seat. So check back in next week for that video. But back to this video, we're putting in the conduit here. Basically, we're going to spray foam insulation into the van, so all the electrical in the ceiling had to have conduit run so that we would be able to get to the places that we needed to with wire, because the spray foam will be filling up that space between the ceiling and the roof of the van. So I was thinking that I could use twine basically to hold the conduit where I wanted it until I spray foamed, and on the first piece it actually worked pretty well. So then I was like, alright, I'll do this as I go down the van. But turns out the string doesn't work too well when you're trying to put multiple outlets down the van, and so I ended up having to make a trip to Lowe's and get the adhesive backed zip tie holders that basically will stick to anything. They make an indoor version and an outdoor version. I went with the outdoor version because I think it was only like 50 cents more for a pack of 10. So I went with that, and those worked much better than my failed attempt at stringing twine across the van. If you want to use a similar type of fastener to the zip tie holders that I used, I'll put a link in the description below to some that are pretty much the same as the ones that I ended up using after I gave up on my string. It did help to have a line down the middle of the van though, so I left the nails in the wood, so if I need to pull a line again when I'm like framing the shower or something down the road, when I need to measure from the center of the van, I'll have a reference point and be able to do that. But as far as getting the conduit to stay up in the ceiling, definitely not a strategy that works. But in the end, we got them all in there. We ran conduit for each of the fan and the AC, and we ran conduit for all of the lights, and we ran conduit for the microwave that will go in the cabinet above the seat that's going under the window. That's something that I could have just run around the perimeter of the van and come back in the back side of the cabinet like I'm going to do in most of the other wires, but I decided that I'll just go ahead and pull a piece of conduit for it. And the other thing is over the sliding door, the contour of the metal actually changes and it leaves a big gap behind the wall. And so that's basically going to be my main electrical chase that brings everything from the front of the van to the back of the van. Well, that pretty much wraps it up for the framing and conduit part of our van build. So if you like what you saw, hit that thumbs up button. If you have any questions or comments, make sure you drop those below and we'll get back to you. And if you're ready for next week's episode about building the shelf, then hit that subscribe button, turn on notifications, and we'll be back next week. Thanks so much for watching.